I still think the evidence suggests that it does encourage people to give, and that's the most important thing. So I'm still happy that people like Gates do talk about what they're doing. And, for example, Forbes magazine, which is most famous for having its rich list of the richest people in America, now also has a sort of most generous list of the people who give the most. And I think I'd love to see the same kind of competition as to who gets to the top of the rich list being there for who gets to the top of the most generous list.
Well, it feels like that your work and the work of the foundation in relation to those people who are billionaires and the wealthiest 0.001% is around making that idea of philanthropy part of the status symbol about being rich.
Yeah, that's certainly right, yeah. It would be much better if people got status from being the most effective altruists rather than simply from being the richest or from having the largest yacht or wearing the most expensive watch on their wrist or whatever else it might be.
You're listening to Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Peter Singer, Professor of Bioethics, Princeton University.
Going back to the bystander effect, I know this comes from the 60s, research that was done after the murder of a woman in New York called Kitty Genovese, where essentially over a few hours she was stabbed to death on a New York street and no one did anything because they expected that somebody else would have made the call to police.
Yes, that's right. It was actually not on the street but in the courtyard of an apartment building, but there were apparently several people in the apartment who heard her cry out, maybe even saw something going on and thought that, well, somebody must be calling the police, and so they didn't bother doing it. Yes, that certainly caused a big stir when it was reported and people started looking at themselves, and psychologists started doing research on the bystander effect and the various factors that might lead people to intervene and not to intervene. And I think this is one of the big problems, again, also with our giving to people in extreme poverty, that we were saying, that people need to be able to see that others are helping and not just think that nobody does this.
I feel like that was the purpose of your thought experiment with the child in the pond.
Not exactly, I think. I think the purpose was to show that if you did not help somebody who you could help easily, not at zero cost, but at a relatively low cost to yourself, that most people would think that was wrong if it was a case where the child was immediately in front of you and you could see the child drowning in the shallow pond and you knew you could rescue the child and you knew there was no one else who was going to do that. And I used that example in order to get people to recognize that there are things that it's wrong not to do, that it's not only that you live a good life if you don't harm others, if you don't cheat or lie or kill or maim or whatever else it might be. That's not enough to live a good life. There can be circumstances in which you're not living ethically if you don't help someone, even if you have no responsibility for that person being in need, and that person is not your child or anything like that. And then I wanted to move from the case of the child in front of you to the case of the child in a low-income country on the other side of the world, and argue that that still applies, that even if you can't see the child, if you know that you have the ability to help the child, perhaps through an effective charity, then it's not really morally significantly different from the case of the child in the pond.
I feel like from a psychological perspective, and this was the way that I approached it, was that the issue with the pond thought experiment was that when you move the example from the child in the pond to a child in another country, you actually have the bystander effect ad infinitum, because people can essentially imagine an infinite number of other people that could possibly be helping and people that are in better positions to help, taking that on. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, you do certainly have the bystander effect. Yes, that is correct. But I think, again, the bystander effect explains the psychology of why people do not act. It doesn't justify not acting. I think we can recognize in the case of Kitty Genovese, who you mentioned, that people were wrong in not calling the police when, possibly the police would have come in time to save her. And it's not an excuse for the fact that, well, there are other people who heard her cries or something and they didn't do anything either. That isn't enough to say, fine, okay, then you didn't do anything wrong. You still did do something wrong. And yes. I think we ought to have that thinking about people in extreme poverty, where in fact there are many people who are doing something, but of course it's true that there are even more who are doing nothing or only trivial amounts.
I guess psychologically the issue is the diffusion of responsibility as well, because it's someone that they are not in direct relation to. And I know you talk about the psychological research that people are more likely to give if you give them the photo of one child in need in a fourth world country rather than the photos of two children. You would think that the giving would increase sort of exponentially, but it doesn't. That people are really, their empathy is really geared towards that individual relationship, it seems, to some extent.
Yes, well, certainly if you have an identifiable individual, that again makes people more likely to donate to help an identifiable individual, rather than say, if I give to the Against Malaria Foundation, which is a highly effective organisation that is distributing bed nets to people in regions where children die from malaria, I will never know which child my donation saved. I may know statistically that it is extremely likely that my donation saved a child, or maybe saved more than one child, depending on how much I gave. But I can't identify the individual who I saved, and that is, for many people, unfortunately, a kind of deterrent, or at least makes it harder for them to actually work themselves up to giving. But again, ethically, we know that they're all real children. Every child is a unique individual. So the fact that we can't see the child, I believe, doesn't really let us off the hook morally.
It does make sense why organisations like World Vision have donations and becoming a sponsor for a specific person or a specific child, and because they know that that's going to be sort of effective, at least in attracting the donation, if not effective necessarily in bettering the life of the greatest number of people.
Right, yes. So that's another thing that I think, again, people need to be aware of. They need to be aware that some organisations will play on the emotional pull, and understandably, and in the sense, if the organisations are still doing some positive good, it's not necessarily bad that they do that in order to get the largest amount of donations. But still, I think if we're aware of that and we think for ourselves that we want to do the most good we can with however much it is that we're able to donate, then it's better to look for organisations that really are the most effective, that are getting us the best value for our dollar, even if that's something that isn't directly pulling on our emotions in the way that organisations that present a single child and tell us we can help that child are pulling on our emotions.
It feels like the focus then is moving away from the idea that we donate or we help or that we act in some sort of altruistic way because of empathy and because of the effective system, and moving towards more of a cognitive appraisal about it.
Yes, that's reasonable. I think we are trying to at least include a cognitive appraisal. I wouldn't say we're moving away from the idea of empathy. Some sort of idea of empathy is perhaps for most people still going to be basic to giving. They're going to be thinking about the people they're helping and about their needs, whether they can identify them or not. But what is important is that the cognitive aspects are involved, that you are thinking about, what am I doing here? Is this the right choice? What's the evidence to say that it is the right choice? How good, how reliable is that evidence? Those ought to be part of any decision to give any kind of significant sum to a non-profit organisation.
It feels like it's one of the most important things in terms of efficacy and effectiveness, but it still probably has to be driven by the effective system to some extent, that you still have to feel something to be motivated to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, pretty much for everybody. Most people, maybe not quite everybody, but for most people, you certainly still have to have the effective systems operating. You have to feel something, and then from feeling something, you say, yes, but is this really the best thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the entire purpose of this organisation is effective altruism. So money being spent in places like you've mentioned, the Against Malaria Foundation, and I think obstetric fistulas, where incredibly good things can be done for people who are in extreme need, and malaria is one of the biggest killers in the world, for very low amounts of money. And I think one of the cynical and sceptical views that tends to come up is the idea that I don't really know when I donate this money towards an organisation whether it's going to be effective. And I don't know, how do we address that? How do we address that concern?
Well, fortunately, the internet has made that so much simpler to address, because you can go online and you can look at the organisation we're talking about, thelifeyoucansave.org, and there's an Australian branch of it, so thelifeyoucansave.org.au. And you can find a list of recommended charities that have been assessed by one or other of the best organisations that do these assessments, that will rigorously check out the organisations that are being recommended and only recommend those that do check out as being highly effective. The Life You Can Save is not the only place to look. There is an American organisation called GiveWell, which you can also look at, which you get a lot of research from. But particularly if you're interested in focusing on Australian charities,